Something strange has been happening across national parks in the United States. People have been going missing, but some cases of missing persons in these national parks are indeed strange and terrifying. I have chosen 3 cases of missing persons that will send shivers down your spine. It would make you wonder what happened to these people, and how could someone vanish without a trace? Could this be caused by alien abductions, or some unknown creature is responsible? For those who were later found, it is not any better. The mystery of their disappearance and the events that followed would make you scared of national parks. So hold on to your blanket for this one. First is the case of George Penka. The case of George Penka is one of the strangest cases of missing persons you will ever hear. When people go missing, it is usually because they went on a hike alone, or they go in a group and the entire group goes missing. Very rarely do people go out in a group and only one person goes missing without a trace. This is exactly what happened to George Penka, and the story just keeps getting stranger the more you dig into it. What makes this story even more captivating is the fact that it happened in Yosemite National Park. In case you do not know, Yosemite is the second on the list of natural parks with the most missing persons per year. In the period of 2018 to 2020, 732 persons went missing in Yosemite alone. But the case of George is indeed a special one among the thousands of missing persons cases in the park's history. George Penka was 30 years old when this incident happened. It was the 17th day of June 2011. George, who was a devoted Christian, had joined a group of 20 people from his church for a hike at the Yosemite National Park. Little did they know that this little church trip would turn into one of the most mysterious cases in America's history. The weather was clear and perfect on that day, and no better time would have been picked than that fateful day for a good time with nature. While those from George's church were just 20 persons, the entire group was 80 people, a large number, but not too large that they could not be managed. Besides, George kept with his church group, so there was nothing extraordinary about the number of people he had come to the park together with. Nothing hinted that something was about to go wrong. There was nothing unusual about his clothing and shoes. He was wearing a black t-shirt, gray sweatpants, and blue sneakers. This was a casual dress that suggested nothing about him having any extra plans for the trail that day. It was obvious he was dressed to go on this trail and immediately leave. Items such as extra clothing, gloves, a hat, thick boots, or clothing for cold weather would have suggested he had extra plans. He did not even have bug spray and had no sunscreen. People who knew George say the way he dressed on the day of his hike was almost the way he dressed all the time. The black shirt he wore had an image of a dog tag on it and the letters D and G. The only mystery item was the blue bag George had with him. Looking through the profile of those who typically go missing on the trail, they always seem to have extra plans and would usually have things like a water flask that suggests that they intend to hike deep into the park. People who met George that morning said he appeared happy, and there was nothing unusual about his behavior. He is generally described as a friendly and fun-loving dude who was active in the church and never hid his love for music, his church, and for sports. The plan that day was to hike to the Upper Yosemite Falls Trail. This trail is notoriously dangerous and can be slippery, so you had better be cautious when on this trail. Besides, it was a long way up too. After all, this was the highest waterfall in all of North America, dropping 2,400 feet from the top to the base. A fall on this trail can be deadly. Even though George was not an experienced hiker, this did not dampen his excitement about going up this trail. As they set out, the group split into two, with one group staying at the base of the falls, taking pictures and enjoying their time, while the other group made their way up the adventurous trail to the top of the fall. George was with the group that went up. This led them through the oak woodland in the park and then the lookout point at the top. Here, they did the usual of taking pictures, admiring the awesome sight, and then made their way down. It was at this point that George told some members of his group that he was thirsty and had to get water. This seems to be the last time anyone saw him. When the group got back to the base, they did a roll call, and that was when they discovered that George was not in the group anymore. Somehow, no one thought too much about it at this time. It was assumed that he had taken another path and would soon rejoin the group. But George never returned. By 9 p.m., it was certain that something was terribly wrong, and they reported George as missing to the park authorities. The park rangers wasted no time in launching a search for George, but somehow there was no trace of George. It looked like he disappeared into thin air. The search for George Penka soon turned into one of the largest and most extensive searches in American history. Soon, a team of 150 search and rescue personnel got involved, and 2 helicopters were deployed to scan the area. Several canine units got involved too, with dogs sniffing the trail up the waterfall and down the creek, but coming up with no leads. In the end, 14 different search and rescue teams got involved in the search, and an area of 70 square miles was searched, but there was no trace of George. One theory was that he fell to his death. This was a reasonable assumption, as many people have fallen to their deaths here. Consider that this waterfall was over 2,400 feet high, so there are a lot of points where a hiker could fall tragically. It is also possible he got swept away in the strong currents and must have died somewhere of hypothermia. The journey to Upper Yosemite was a steep 3,000-foot hike that could be exhausting, and the steps can be tricky. So maybe he hit his head somewhere while falling. This makes no sense, as it would have been super easy to find him if this was the case, so let us talk about some realistic theories. One of the most plausible explanations could be an animal attack. Yosemite had its fair share of black bears and mountain lions, and these predators could take down a human if there was enough motivation to do so. But encountering any of these predators would mean George had strayed far into the park, which is hard to agree with considering the conditions under which he disappeared and how quickly the search party was organized. If we eliminate this theory, it leaves us with only 2 theories, and these theories are bone-chilling. So brace yourself for what is coming next. The most reasonable theory is that George was abducted. By who? That is the part that is unclear. By aliens, perhaps if you believe in alien abductions, or by a mystical creature lurking in the shadows of Yosemite National Park. Something sinister could be here, and some cases of missing persons in this park are so sudden and unexplainable that it makes sense to think they were abducted by beings we know nothing about. Or it could be an abduction by a serial killer. We can never eliminate that possibility. People are going missing here, and sometimes only their dead bodies are found. So it makes sense to think a serial killer could be on the loose here. While these are reasonable theories, they lack merit, as there was no sign of any struggle. Or maybe the alien abduction theory will pass this huddle, as they may have zapped him from above. The only problem was, it was broad daylight, so someone should have seen or heard something. This leaves us with one other possibility. A conspiracy by some members of this group cannot be ruled out. Don't you agree? What if someone or some people in his church group planned and carried out his disappearance? What if he was intentionally pushed off a cliff or something similarly sinister? After all, members of the group had refused to cooperate fully with investigators. They all refused to submit their phones to the investigators, and it was reported that they did not cooperate during questioning. The authorities had no reason to prosecute anyone in the group, so they were all allowed to go. Besides, George's family was not pressing charges against the church or group that should have been responsible for his safety on this trip. But we have not asked one very important question so far. What was in the blue bag George Penka was carrying? Some people say the disappearance of George was designed by George himself. Most people who believe this say he had gone off to join a cult. They had noticed he was becoming a fan of some dark kind of music. Some also said he had become obsessed with paranormal theories and showed interest in aliens, cryptids, and related stuff. The only evidence left is a footprint trail from the top of the waterfall that led to the creek. Then the footprint trail returned to the waterfall, and that was all. If he jumped, someone would have seen it. The intensive search lasted about 2 weeks, and finally, the search parties had to give up. What happened to George Penka? No one knows to this day. The next story will shock you even more, so get ready for this. The story of Stacey Aris is one you need to hear. It is simply one of the most confusing and mysterious cases of a missing person. There is a strong possibility of multiple cover-ups in this case, as you will see. It happened on the 17th of July, 1981. Stacey Aris was out in Yosemite National Park with her father George for a camping and horse riding trip. They were not alone on this trip. They had come together with a group of 6 other riders, and their destination was the Sunrise High Sierra Camp, which is located along the Sierra Trail. This camp had 9 cabins that could accommodate about 34 people. The exact number of people lodging there at this time is information we cannot be certain of. Stacey was just 14 years old at the time and was 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed about 120 pounds. According to her father, she could easily pass for a girl that was much younger. After arriving at the camp, it was reported that Stacey suggested to her dad that they both take a little walk to see some of the scenery around the camp. Her dad said she initially had flip-flops on, but he asked her to change into hiking boots. She wore a gray windbreaker and wore a white blouse with white shorts which had red stripes. For accessories, she wore a pair of blue dot earrings and had a gold anklet on one ankle. Since it was just a casual stroll, she only had her Olympus camera, a pack of chewing gum, and probably cigarettes. According to George, he did not want to go for this stroll, so he stayed behind at the cabin. This is the last verified information we have about Stacey, and this is where the mystery begins. There is a report that Stacey met this mysterious old man who was either 72 or 77 along the trail, and they probably walked together. How this information was obtained is unclear, and the identity of this old man is a big mystery. Along the line, the name Gerald Stort was pinned on this man's identity, but that name has been useless so far. There is no record of who this man was or what he was doing in the park at the time. This information about this man would only come out about 30 years after Stacey went missing. Some people say Gerald was Stacey's grandfather. This is the only way this weird link-up can be explained, but this is not information we are sure of. Together, this unusual pair made their way towards the lake. It is reported that after walking with Stacey for about 30 minutes, the old man decided he could not continue. Gerald found a log along the path, and that is where he claimed to have sat, waiting for her to return. At this point, they would have been about a mile or a mile and a half away from the camp in the direction of Sunrise Lake. Some theories suggest that Gerald is lying and actually got to the lake with Stacey, as the lake was only a mile away, and that time frame was enough for them to get to the lake. Now, this is the story. Gerald had sat there waiting for several hours, but Stacey never returned. He then saw a group of hikers coming from the direction she headed towards and asked them if they had seen her. None of these hikers had seen Stacey or any girl that fit her description on that trail. This makes the story of Gerald very questionable. Is it possible he got to the lake with Stacey, did away with her, and returned to sit on that log waiting to establish an alibi? An old man not being able to walk for 30 minutes, but being able to sit for several hours along a path sounds sketchy, you'll agree. But hey, we cannot jump to conclusions. All we know is the story does not add up. It was after meeting the hikers on the trail that Gerald decided it was time to report Stacey missing. The Sierra staff were the first responders, and they set out in search of Stacey. It was getting late, so they were only able to search for some time into the night. There was little they could do, so they called for an actual professional search team to come in the morning. The next morning, the search resumed with a team from the National Park Service itself. This time, it was a full-fledged search that involved up to 100 people from various search and rescue organizations. These were professionals, including rock climbers, who were actually paid to be involved in this search. What the professionals noted was that it would have been extremely difficult for Stacey, who was not an experienced hiker or rock climber, to have made it far considering the terrain. It is therefore reasonable to assume that, if she lost her way, These professionals would have caught up to her that next day. Besides, helicopters were also called in, and they would have seen her if she was around the area and needed help. It simply makes no sense that she just disappeared. Some people have noted that the lakes were never searched. I cannot verify this, but since divers were not part of the search team, it is possible that the lakes were indeed not searched. This leaves us wondering if something had happened to her and she was at the bottom of the lake. The search lasted 11 days and nothing was found. There are reports that Stacy had problems with her family, and this could have made her use this opportunity to run away with her boyfriend. But this does not make any sense. If she wanted to flee, there were better ways she could have done it, and better timing too. But the most compelling reason not to believe this theory is that it was impossible for her to get out of that terrain quickly enough that the search team would not have seen her. The direction she went was simply too challenging to use as a route for a quick getaway. This takes us back to the last person who saw Stacy alive, Gerald, the old man. Who exactly was this man, and could he have some motive to harm Stacy? Surely he must be a member of her family, as that is the only reasonable explanation as to why he would have been with her. It is also the only reason why the police did not investigate him. It is a safe guess to assume Gerald was indeed her grandfather, as some have suggested. The question now is, what does this old man know that he is not telling anyone? If he abducted her, where did he hide her? It would be impossible for him to have kept her alive, so the question is, if she's dead, where is the body? This seems like the most reasonable explanation, but there is something fishy that I've not mentioned. The government is reluctant to release the official report on this case. If you request details of what happened to Stacy from the government, you will be denied. Several people have tried, and they were not given the official report. Without the official report, we keep guessing blindly, and it makes us wonder why the government is covering this case up. Could it be because it contains some information that would spook the suspect? Or is it indeed a cover-up to protect someone? The next case is that of an experienced ranger and one of the oddest disappearances you will ever hear of. How could someone with all the experience needed still go missing? This is the story of David Barkley Miller. David is the type of guy everyone wants to be friends with in school. He was the definition of cool, and his leadership skills were exceptional. He was athletic and always the captain of any team he chose to play for. David was the type of person that easily associated with people without any problems. He was almost always positive and radiating with energy. Now, this is not to paint him as the nicest person, it is just who he was. Tragedy struck when David was still a young lad. He had 2 siblings who died from a bone disease, and it was this tragic incident that shaped David's life. Instead of allowing it to discourage him, David found comfort in doing activities that drew him close to nature. You can say he was an outdoor person, and you will be right. In his teens, David was already traveling the world to find the next challenge nature could throw at him. His favorite activity was kayaking, which he claimed built his resilience and prepared him for other challenges. It was not just a hobby for David, it was a lifestyle and a path to the future he wanted for himself. His coaches in high school say they have never seen a kid that had the winning spirit David had. He showed 100% commitment to anything he did. There were no half measures for David. By the time David Miller was 20, he had a long list of adventures he had conquered. He had been to some pretty extreme places, such as Alaska, and been up some dangerous mountains too. At 22, David got his dream job. He was employed as a wilderness ranger by the U.S. Forest Service out of Coconino National Forest in Arizona. This happened in April of 1998. Oh boy, was David happy. This was not just a job to him. This was him getting paid to do what he loved. Unfortunately, David would only enjoy this job for a month because the next month, something we cannot explain happened. His parents, Barbara and Ira Miller, knew the dangers of their son's adventures, but they could not hold him back from doing what he loved. He had suffered enough tragedy already, and stopping him from these dangerous expenditures was going to make him unhappy, so they let him be and only hoped he would be safe. On the 19th of May 1998, David decided he was going on a hike that would last 2.5 days. He would be off duty in this period, and yet the best way he wanted to spend his time was to explore the wilderness where he was a ranger. Remember, this was a guy that knew exactly what he was doing and made the right preparations for this hike. He duly informed his co-workers of his intentions and left the office wearing a t-shirt, shorts, and black hiking boots. He had a green backpack that contained the tools and resources he needed for his hike. As for his physical appearance, David was 5 foot 11 inches tall. He weighed 160 pounds and had an athletic body. His eyes were grayish blue, and his hair was a sandy blonde color. He departed the Beaver Creek Ranger Station, and that was the last his co-workers saw him. His destination was not a mystery, as he left a note indicating that he was headed to the Red Rock Secret Mountain Wilderness. He must have driven his van to the Voltiarch Trail before proceeding on foot, because that was where his van was found some days later. When it was discovered that David was missing, it was his family and friends who first set out to find him. Alone, they searched for several days before authorities took the search up. The local sheriff's office got involved and deployed 50 men to this search that lasted 12 days. Even though they combed the area vigorously, nothing was found. There was no trace of David, and there was no trace of any of his possessions. David Miller had simply vanished. It was a mystery that this young man just vanished like that, without any hint of what happened to him. Some people propose that David slipped along the trail and that must have knocked him cold. This was likely. The only problem is that his body was not found. Then there's the theory that he met a predator, but again, no remains were found. According to newspaper reports, the search was extensive, complete with helicopters and sniffer dogs. The park rangers did not give up on their young colleague. Long after the official search was over, they still kept their eyes peeled for any hint of David. Hikers who also heard this story became interested in finding him. David Miller had become a sort of a legend in this region, and people felt it was the right thing to be on the lookout for anything that would help resolve the case of David's disappearance. After months of searching, the parents of David had no choice but to accept that he must be dead. They held the first memorial service for David in May of 1999. It has now become a tradition in this region, so much so that people who never knew David still pay homage to him. Arizona's wilderness, for all its breathtaking beauty, can indeed be quite dangerous. The dangers lurk in various forms, from the unforgiving terrain and scorching sun to the diverse array of wild creatures. The number one problem here is the heat. Arizona summers are brutal, with temperatures soaring above 115 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas. The relentless sun and dry air can lead to dehydration, heat stroke, and even death if proper precautions aren't taken. If it rains here, the dangers get worse. Monsoon season in Arizona can bring sudden, violent downpours that transform dry washes into raging torrents. These flash floods can easily sweep away unsuspecting hikers and vehicles. Then there is the danger of getting hypothermia. Even in the desert, nights can get surprisingly cold, especially at higher elevations. Underestimating the temperature and not packing adequate warm clothing can lead to hypothermia. But it is unlikely David froze to death, as this was not the season when this could happen. Maybe, somehow, David got hot and disoriented. The vastness and ruggedness of the wilderness can make it easy to lose your way. Without proper navigation skills and supplies, getting lost can have serious consequences. Arizona is home to 13 species of rattlesnakes, more than any other state. These venomous snakes pose a serious threat, especially if you're not careful where you step. Did David step on a rattler? If he did, why did he not call for help? Even though David had some experience hiking, the Arizona desert should never be underestimated. The vast and unforgiving wilderness of Arizona has claimed its share of lives and stolen countless others into its mysteries. These stories of disappearances serve as stark reminders of the dangers that lurk beneath the breathtaking beauty of the desert landscapes. One such case is that of Cayman Welch, a young tattoo artist who vanished without a trace in 2020. He was exploring the remote Superstition Mountains with his uncle when, in a moment of distraction, he simply disappeared. Despite extensive searches, no sign of Kaiman was ever found, leaving his family and friends heartbroken and the circumstances of his disappearance shrouded in an unsettling enigma. Another chilling tale is that of Melody Harrison, a 15-year-old girl who vanished in 1992. Her remains were only discovered 31 years later in a desolate area outside Phoenix, highlighting the enduring grip the desert can have on its secrets. The investigation into her death remains open, with authorities even exploring the possibility of a serial killer connection, adding a layer of unsettling mystery to her tragic fate. These are just two examples of the many disappearances that have haunted Arizona's wilderness. Hikers get lost in the maze of canyons, overwhelmed by the unforgiving heat and disorienting terrain. Flash floods can transform dry washes into raging torrents, sweeping unsuspecting adventurers away in a matter of seconds. In honor of David, the authorities have named one of the trails after him. Today, as the Coconino Forest, you will find the trail called David Miller. This should be a reminder of who he was and what he stood for. It is also a reminder that everyone out in a national park has to be careful. Get ready for the next episode on this channel. If you do not want to miss it, subscribe to the channel.